then Derczynski, who will talk to us about joint rumour stance on Veracity.
Hi, lovely. A brief statement from the top. This is a slightly technical talk, working in natural language processing, where there's an emerging narrative that English is a desperately overprivileged language in terms of study. And so here we might deviate a little bit and look at two others as well. Okay, so let's talk about some rumours. Here we have some claims you might find out on the web. Mostly, I think, largely suspicious. Arresting a mother after the dog has eaten her seems technically complex in the least. But it's much, much easier to generate and flood the web with these rumours and stories based on them now that we can automatically generate content. And indeed, this is with GPT-2, which in terms of NLP is a little outdated now. We have, for example, Grover with its nuclear sampling, which in benchmarks generates misinformative stories that are more believable to human evaluators than the human-generated misinformation. So fact-checking was pretty tough before, and it's not going to get any easier. What we could do with this? We could do with some automatic methods for detecting misinformation. So I've identified 4 channels through which this could be detected, 4 kind of sources of information: through an account's behaviour, through the network an account uses or information is propagated through, by verifying individual claims, and in cases where none of those will work, we can do stance detection and monitor the reaction to a claim. Okay, so if we look at the metadata, some of you may have seen it's possible to do an analysis of when an account is active. This, one would expect, would roughly follow the diurnal patterns of the local population's activity. The top account here was claimed to be from a Lebanese journalist based in Israel, who is very strangely very active during 9 to 5 Pacific time. A little suspicious. However, the second account is in fact completely legitimate. It's from the ex-Prime Minister of Denmark, Lars Løkke Rasmussen. Very short chap, very difficult to photograph, kind of a Tom Cruise thing going on. But in this case, we can see the majority of his content is produced between 11 p.m. and midnight on Sundays. This is always flagged as suspicious. So there's something in the metadata that can perhaps identify candidate accounts. All right, how about the network? So this is a graphic from a study of, there might even be people in the room who have created this graphic actually, but it's from a study of where Brexit-related misinformation was funneled. The network was partly based in the UK, partly in Germany. And these kinds of things can work very well. We have the standard generator amplifier model, where amplifiers build a following that is targeted very precisely. They know their demographic, and they will select pieces of information that fit the narrative they intend to create. So if we're missing this information, and for the majority of accounts we are missing this information, right? We're kind of the individual consumer is kind of the very last edge of the network, furthest away from the source before it's reached. So it's quite possible none of these suspicious features are directly available. So instead we could use language processing to go and parse a sentence and extract information, maybe about the subject and the predicate and a value or object. And then we can go and compare this with something like a triple store or a knowledge base. And this kind of activity is part of many approaches to the fever challenge. So once we have the statement, we can try and verify it. Here we have a little box taken from Wikipedia, certainly mostly powered by Wikidata. And we could take these 3 propositions. Firstly, Aarhus has a population of 9 million, which is patently false given Denmark is only 6 million. Mette Frederiksen is the Prime Minister of Denmark. This would be also verified by those entries in the knowledge base. And then also we have issues of falsifiability, where there will be some claims, such as Hillary Clinton is possessed by a demon, which are very hard to refute, because we don't have a test for that. Okay, so this is one of the problems we have, right? I guess it's maybe a little wacky example. We can ground it a bit more, well, not that much more. So we have this problem where these facts can't necessarily be verified because we don't have them in our knowledge bases. And in fact, it goes a little deeper because when we don't have that technology to extract the information from a claim and build that triple to go and look in a store, then we can't do it at all, right? So if we're working in English, it's okay. Once we're beyond English, we have significant problems. So here we might have town hall is made of chocolate. Usually, when you look at the Wikidata entry for a town hall, the building material is not listed, so it's hard to verify. Or maybe the ex-immigration minister has previously been a member of the Russian mafia. Usually, one's membership in the Russian mafia is not stated on Wikipedia. Okay, so what can we do about this? We can look at how people react to claims. So here we have a claim, well, there's a claim which is at the top, and then we have some attitudes towards that claim. And we can say, there can be various ontologies of how we label or code those reactions. And the intuition here is that claims that are questioned or disagreed with are probably a little more suspicious than others. So this goes back a little bit. There's a paper from around a decade ago, which is actually based on early work monitoring the spread of memes through a community. And people would have certain attitudes to memes. And so one hypothesis came that the attitude people have towards a claim is an indication of that claim's truth. So even if we have no other external sources of knowledge, we can simply look at the crowd, in essence, and measure their reaction. And this fits quite a lot with kind of the general ideas of how knowledge exists in human societies. It's essentially a reification of social constructivism. What does stance prediction look like? We might have some ontologies. Do we confirm? Do we deny? Are we doubtful about something? Maybe we're commenting or querying. But the label is always in the context of a claim. There must be a target claim, and we measure the respondent's attitude towards that claim. So we tried to do this for Danish. There was no data for Danish. I was funded in Danish, working in Denmark in English, but there was no data for Danish, right? And so we should build some of this, especially if one has a small amount of labor available. So we built this data set. Twitter's not really used in Denmark, and we can't really use Facebook data, so we went with Reddit, actually, which is richer than Twitter for this kind of thing in Denmark, bringing a strong demographic bias with it, just as Twitter does there as well. So we have this Danish stance data set. There's an example with some fairly rough text about a kind of a Swedish-Danish dispute. But the essence is there'll be a claim at the top, which is the post, and then there'll be a number of comment trees beneath this, each of which is a directed acyclic graph, no multiple inheritance. It was pretty tough to annotate this, and often the best way of coding data efficiently is to build a custom tool, if you have the resources, to do that. So we built a custom tool and went through a few thousand Danish Reddit comments. And here we see we have 3,000 posts broken into 16 rumours, and we see this typical distribution of stances where C for comment is the most prevalent class. Okay, so the next thing we have to do, we want to try and predict this stance on new texts, on new comments. And in order to predict that, we need to include both the comment, but also the claim that the comment addresses. So we used conditional encoding for this, where one iterates through the target, the claim-bearing text, and then goes through the referring comment afterwards. And also we use some branch-level prediction using, again, so we break down this complex conversational tree to many paths from root to final comment. And then we can model the path through each of these as a sequence of stances. So one way of doing this, the one we took, was to use machine learning approaches. Of course, now we know that the stance data sets we have are very small, and neural methods require, pretty much, large data sets. And we'd seen in the past there wasn't quite enough of this, so we continued with approaches we knew were good, but we also tried some non-neural network methods. And a couple of baselines as well. The first, where we would always assign the most common stance, which would be comment overwhelmingly, which is kind of useless. If no one is supporting or disagreeing with the claim, we have a bit of difficulty assessing that claim's veracity. Also, we'd use a stratified classifier, just taking a random baseline balanced according to that class distribution. Bit of a retro slide if you're a technologist working with machine learning, where we have a set of non-neural methods and kinds of features that are often elided in neural methods, but we had logistic regression, SVM, and some selection of features that had been shown to be useful in the past for this kind of task. How well did we do? It's a tough task. The accuracy figure is high-ish. This is high-ish for NLP, depending on the task. But because there's that huge unbalance in the data, right, because most of the comments don't support or deny the central claim, this doesn't necessarily give the whole picture. So we also evaluate the F1 measure. And an F1 measure of 0.42 actually isn't so far off the state of the art for stance detection. Okay, so we have the stances. What next? The real goal here is to predict the veracity. So we model this conversation as a sequence of stances. That's how we'll think about it, right? We won't worry about the content in each comment, just here's a person commenting, querying, disagreeing, maybe another person branching off and disagreeing over there, and we can model it as a branch. So we train models to we train hidden Markov models to build up an idea of how the conversation looks around a true claim, and a separate one to model how conversations look around a false claim. And these conversations are only described in terms of the stance, not the text. And then when we find that there's a claim and there's a new conversation around it, we can simply kind of give that conversational pattern to both of these models and see which one comes up as the most likely. So with the examples at the bottom, here's one with someone supporting, commenting, supporting, querying, and so on. And here we'd say the real claim model gives a higher probability, 0.31, than the false claim model. So we tentatively suggest this claim is more likely to be true. And opposite for the bottom example, you can see querying, denying, denying, commenting, denying, denying. The crowd doesn't seem so happy about this claim. And indeed, the model here in the example would have a higher probability for a false claim. So this was the model published last year at Coling. So we wanted to think a little broader, right? How can we take the conversations and represent them for our veracity prediction? First, we started taking each branch as a source, or maybe we could take each top-level comment as a source, or maybe we could take the entire Reddit submission. So we thought of a few different ways of representing conversations. Because you can see we're getting a few levels of abstraction away from the real conversation. We thought it's good to broaden out a little bit at this point. We tried two kinds of models, one which just looks at the sequences of stance, but another model which also measures the time between each comment. Often the dialogue can shift if you have the immediate aftermath of a claim, and then you look at when people turn up a few weeks or even years later, their attitudes can be quite different. And then we took a baseline that measured the distribution of the stances and assigned the most similar veracity label. The idea with this was to determine if the sequence of comment stances had an effect. And it did. So here we found that taking the branch as the source did really well. We were getting 83% accuracy at predicting veracity based on the comment stance alone, with no text involved in here. And also a state-of-the-art F1 measure. The state-of-the-art isn't great, is the thing I would say immediately with that. But that's where we are today. So we can see the branches source does really well, and those temporal spacings, right? The rows with the omega, the middle rows, this one seems to give us the highest score when we take time of comment into account. Okay, that's pretty neat. So maybe we can start thinking, are these stance structures language-specific? So we trained on a larger data set. This one from developed during the theme project. This one is, and we looked at there's a little bit of French in there, but we looked just at the English and German. And we trained our models on this, and then we evaluated over the Danish content. And this was the English German is over Twitter, and because of Twitter's design, it promotes and encourages quite different tones and structures and kind of turn-taking modalities compared to Reddit. But nevertheless, if we switch language at this point, we still get those really high scores, right? That the accuracy of 0.82, 0.88, and the F1 is in fact slightly higher. Of course, the English data is bigger, so we explained it like this. But this was a really interesting finding. It seems that those conversational structures people have in these three languages, when they're constructing truth, seem to be very similar, seem to move across from one to the other. I'd be very interested at this point to try on something from a different culture where we have different kinds of information flow. One wonders if it's based on the language or if there's some kind of social effect going on here. What do people discuss differently? And the positive implication is that perhaps there's a lot more data available than we thought. If we can take in the data from every language, we have a much easier job with each language that's gone in. Okay, just a little bit of end-to-end verification. So those models of predicting veracity based on stance alone were taken from gold standard data. How well do we do if we have the real kind of out there task, if we're automatically assigning labels and then estimating veracity based on those automatically assigned labels? So essentially we take a Reddit post and we give no other supervision and we try and work out whether or not this is true or false. We still do pretty well. The accuracy is up there over 80%, and the F1 score is roughly where it was before. We get comparable results, in fact, to what we had using the gold labels, but with some variance depending on the way we represent structure. So it turns out this, and by the way, the neural method was no good for this, we found out. I mean, it was the SVM, right, that had the highest score for stances. And so the SVM predicted stance works well enough to give us helpful predictions here. One other interesting thing we have, though. So it's okay to have a system that churns out a bunch of predictions, but different people have different needs. Some fact-checking agencies find themselves starved of data. Others are more interested in only going to verify the most suspicious cases. So in this case, we have some data that would come through as unverified for the conclusion, and we could tune the precision or the recall of the system depending on how we treat those outputs of unverified. If something's unverified, would we rather check it or would we rather ignore it? So we get an extra dial here. Do we want to follow up that claim about Hillary's possession? Okay, so the news here, I guess, is the stance data now for a Nordic language, which we haven't had before. We can see that actually it's worth reconsidering neural versus non-neural methods for high variance, highly dependent data, like we have with the stance prediction task. And we can see that stance also can predict veracity, not only for English using English training data, but also for Danish using English training data, and vice versa, and go across Reddit and Twitter. So there's something interesting, and I think very positive, going on here. So that's all from me. Thank you very much.
I have time for a couple of questions.
Hi, thank you for the talk, really nice. I found it really interesting that it actually worked to do the cross-lingual experiment, mainly because I think the film dataset is on Twitter, right?
Right.
And so it's also cross-platform that we were going.
Yeah.
So I was wondering if you did any analysis of the topics to see if any of the topics actually failed or worked better.
There is deeper analysis in the paper, and we have 16 rumours. I can't remember all the details off the top of my head. One thing we were very happy about, actually, so if you remember the theme dataset, I think 3 or 4 of the stories in there are related to shooting. So we end up having a lot of text training data around guns and shooting, and so whenever you try and do an evaluation over other rumours around this kind of event, one gets markedly improved performance. We don't have anything about shooting because Denmark is a very boring country. That's one of its positive qualities, I think. No, that's fairly uncontroversial. We were very happy that we didn't see a big performance drop because no one got shot. We were relieved about that. I think we did have some problems with these rumours about a submarine-based kidnapping, which turned out extremely gruesome. And you can imagine there'd be some unusual words related to submarines, which one wouldn't find in the rest of the data. And I mean, even as I say things look positive regarding data, 3,000 examples isn't very many.
One more question.
Hi, thanks for the talk. I was wondering if you did any kind of study related to the length of the sequence of comments, let's say, meaning how long must the sequence be in order to have an accurate prediction? Because maybe you have lots of comments, maybe you have just a few.
Yeah. It's a great question. Actually, we had some selection bias in our dataset construction where things that were very short we assumed wouldn't go very well. So we don't have so much data on that end of the spectrum. And I think perhaps if there aren't so many comments, it's a bit dangerous to start making predictions, and maybe more responsible for a system to say, I don't know. But yeah, that's very important.
Okay. Sven Cardian then.